If I could ask you to turn to chapter 4 of your handbook, which is framing regulations, that's the topic we'll be covering in this talk. I'd like to pick up on two important concepts that Dr. Krishna and Dr. Shah mentioned already in their talks. One is the notion of separation of powers within the state and within regulators, and which will lead us into the question of why is process important and how does it protect the regulator just as much as it protects regulated entities. This is a big question in terms of why is legal process for framing regulations so important for regulators as well as for the system as a whole. So I'll spend just 5 or so slides on a little bit of background and large ideas, and then we'll get down into the very specific questions of what the handbook is mandating in terms of process to be followed by the regulators. So as Dr. Shah mentioned, a crucial feature of a rule of law system is separation of powers, in which the state's legislative, executive, and judiciary functions are all carried out with separations between them by separate agencies, hopefully whose incentives have been designed such that they can produce the right outcomes without interference with each other, and that yield just and efficient outcomes for society as a whole. The problem that we face with a regulatory state is that regulators are mini states unto themselves. As Dr. Shah mentioned, it's a difficult thing to do when a particular regulator is making regulations, detecting violations, and issuing orders against regulated entities all under one roof. So the question is, how do we design these regulators so that they can perform these functions independently? What are the checks and balances that we need to build into it? So as we think about those questions, it's good to keep in mind some theory of accountability and the larger conversations that are happening around government and governance reform. We have a strong sense, and it's just accepted as wisdom now, that transparency and participation increases the legitimacy of government actions. And then when you have legitimate actions, when the actions of the regulators are viewed as being legitimate by the regulated entities, they may tend to dispute those outcomes less. You may have higher compliance, and that allows the regulator to focus on enforcement, investigation, and adjudication. So, in other words, process, yes, there's a lot of literature and a lot of thinking in how process protects regulated entities. That is to say, the firms and other people have a sense that they are involved in a just process. But the emphasis here is also that process protects regulators. And as Dr. Krishnan mentioned, this is something that's important to be able to run an efficient bureaucracy as well, is that those decisions are taken and are viewed as legitimate by the people who are being regulated. So, in very short order, what does it mean practically speaking for a regulator? The rules of thumb that we came up with and that we have experienced as well from working with regulators here and abroad is quite simply announce what it is you plan to do in a way that is public, transparent, and participative. Then you do it, and then you explain what you have done. By breaking down your processes into these steps and ensuring that there's participation as much as possible, you reduce chances for conflict, and you also are probably going to have better outcomes because better information has flowed into the decision-making process. So, good governance for regulators. And as far as framing regulations is concerned, which is a legislative function, the emphasis is on the fact that all processes, that includes framing regulations, are rule-bound. This alone will be a major step forward. And we have discussed with regulators in India, and we have checked with examples abroad. There are many different ways to achieve this. The handbook presents the best practices that we have found. Regulation making, when you follow all the steps, is time-consuming, it's difficult, it requires a lot of thought, it's a technical exercise, but it's also where the full force of regulation, of the power of the regulation must be brought to bear. All the brain power, all the technical expertise must be brought to bear in this exercise. In the next few slides, my colleague Kushagra will walk through an overview of what that process means as far as the handbook is concerned.
I'm just going to give you an overview of Chapter 4, what it entails and what is the philosophy behind it. Now, before we even get into the steps of what Chapter 4 entails, and probably that's a question that keeps coming back to us, that we are already following that process. And I wholeheartedly agree that you guys are already fulfilling the process. But here we have an attempt to make this process more distinct, more structured, more process driven at each levels. So basic idea was, what is that philosophy, that higher value that we seek to achieve by having these processes? And after much debate, we picked up these 3 lines from the handbook, which basically captures that higher value. A structured process that allows all stakeholders participation. The idea is, fair enough, regulation by meaning will have step 1 to step 7. But what is that higher value we are trying to achieve here? And the higher value that we are trying to achieve here is legitimacy of the 3 I's of the regulators. I number 1, the institution itself. I number 2, the individuals that make that institution. And I number 3, the instrument that is a product of the confluence between the institution and the instrument. Keeping that philosophy in mind, I think this is a 1-slide representation of entire chapter 4. And I can recommend that tomorrow, whenever you have doubts about where we are in the process and what we need to look at, just this 1 slide can give you the whole picture. So this slide encapsulates the highest principle of governance. Now, we are drawing from the age-old principle of governance that any institution, most critical decisions should be taken at the highest level by a collective application of mind. So if you see all these blue boxes, and I like to, it's a little intimidating, all these blue boxes represent a critical decision making in the process of regulation making. And all the non-blue boxes, I don't know which color that is, so all the non-blue boxes represent a preparatory work, something that needs to go in for that decision to be made. So this is the running theme that we are going to follow all through it. We've actually tried to concretize the philosophy of when we say what is all stakeholders participation. We are trying to here actually break that down at a ground level and tell you that if you follow this process, you fulfill that amorphous philosophy of all stakeholders participation. But before even we get into those steps, the first step that handbook states is all regulators board need to, by a resolution, establish this process. That is a step 0. That's what we've called. So the first step would be that all regulators adopt at the board level this whole process. Now we go on to the actual steps. So the first step, logical which it may sound, is staff members of the regulators are the eye and ear of the regulator. They are the interface with the market. They are the ones who are the agony aunts. They are the ones who are keeping a tab on what's going in the market. So they are the first cue on looking at a problem and then saying that, okay, an intervention is required, which probably is happening. That's a question that we always get, that that's something which is happening right now. Now, in later slides, Arjun will tell you how this process needs to be more structured and what thought process needs to go in for you to actually think about what is the problem and what intervention is required. So once a basic proposal is in your mind that, look, there is a problem and we need to have an intervention, we go to the board and tell them that, oh, this is the process. We think that a regulatory intervention is required. The board, on that preliminary basis, applies its minds and says that, yes, we agree with you. Go ahead, do the actual drafting part. So that's step number 1 and 2. Now we come to step number 3 and 4. Now step number 3 and 4, as I said, there will be a decision, there will be some act, there will be a decision, there will be some act, and there will be a decision. That's how we move on. At this step, the staff members actually draft the document, which probably is happening right now. But the departure that we are making from the current practice is there will be additional documents that will be attached to any draft regulation. That would be a statement of objective, problems regulation seeks to solve, and third, cost-benefit analysis. We have separate sessions on all of this, what exactly. So when you go ahead and draft, it will accompany all these 3 statements with an elaborate things to do statements that will be dealt in a different session. Once the draft is done, the draft again goes to the board. The board blesses the draft that, okay, we are fine with it. These are the changes we need to make. Please make them. Once that is done, it's released in public. Now, again, that there was a question from the regulators to us that we are already doing a public consultation process. And we agree that you probably are doing a consultation process. But we'll show you with examples how it's done internationally, how a best practice model can be brought into this whole consultation process. So once the consultation comes in, all the comments have come in. The final step is obviously go to the board, all right? With all the comments, the board applies its mind, comes out with the final form of the regulation. Here, there is another departure. The departure under handbook is that once you come out with a regulation, you also come out with the response on major suggestions or major departure or major responses that you have to the comments, which probably in some sense is not happening. Because we want to know that what is the regulatory stand, what is the regulatory stand on each substantive. It can be argued that you cannot make representations on all the commas and full stops that were received. But we want the staff to have at least a response from the regulator documented on most substantive issues. So this probably is the whole picture, and Arjun is going to give you exact examples of each of these steps that's happening in international arena.
So if I could ask you to turn to page 42 of your handbook, you'll see we've included an example of just such a document. Now, out of our 7 steps, this corresponds to step 2 actually, but we'll talk about 1 and 2 together. So you can see here, this is an example of the Securities and Exchange Commission of the United States, in which they have a few days before this was accessed or modified just before the meeting agenda, but they have held a meeting. The board meeting has been announced to the public, and one of the items up for consideration during the board meeting on this agenda is in fact the fact that the Commission will consider rules for some purpose or the other. Now, this is a relatively small step, but it's one of the fundamental pieces of architecture that makes for a rule of law system. Its value to the regulated space is very high. It's a small act, but it actually speaks to the level of systems and processes that are in place for this particular regulator. Now, what we really want to talk about is not just the simple act of announcing that a board meeting is coming up and that a resolution may be passed regarding draft regulations. What is also interesting to us is the process that the staff goes through in preparing the work for the board. Now, this relatively simple statement that the board will consider actually rests on the fact that they are going to be going through some technical proposal that has been prepared by their staff. Now, when it comes to that board resolution, the board is the apex body. We hope and believe that the best minds in that regulated space are going to apply themselves to the decision. And the 2 questions that they should be asking, according to the handbook principles, are, should we regulate in the first place? And if we are going to regulate, how should we regulate? Well, the question is, how does the staff of the regulator assist the board in making this complex determination? Now, according to the IFC, which is not law yet, but which we look to for inspiration, and which is in line with best practices, we believe that there are 5 major questions that should be a part of the staff consideration as the staff feeds its documents to the board. The staff should be thinking about what is the objective of the proposed regulation. That would involve looking at what is the job of the regulator. Is the job of the regulator to fix this problem, or does it lie outside the jurisdiction? The staff should and could be able to do that first cut analysis. The next thing is to say, what is the problem that the proposed regulation seeks to address? Is there something that can be fixed by regulation at all? And is it again within the purview of the regulator? It's the job of the staff to build that case and make that case to the board. This goes, of course, is supported by legal analysis, the underlying principles of the relevant act for that regulator, and also a statement of what is it hoped that the act will achieve. How will the act under which the regulator is created be furthered? How will the objective be furthered by this action? An entire separate session that we will cover later is on the costs and benefits, and this is really the core of the kind of thinking that needs to go into it for the finer distinctions and the finer thought process. Now, this rather intimidating diagram simply shows that there are these 5 components under the IFC. Each of those involves a separate consideration. They're tightly integrated, but they're separate parts of the question. The IFC is helpful to regulators because it actually states the objectives and principles of each section separately. So when the regulator staff is asking those 5 questions, there are specific answers that can be culled. But the thing is, we're not working with the IFC just yet. We are working with the handbook, and the handbook takes these 5 recommendations, these 5 parts, and compresses them into something which can be answered using the current law. I don't believe it's the case that all the laws and rules that are currently binding on regulators do not all state, for example, objectives and principles explicitly. They may have preambles that provide that information, but it's not necessarily set out in this way. So, which leads us to the fact that under the handbook, it is just 3 documents that are required to be submitted along with the draft regulation. One is a statement of objectives, one is a statement on the problem that the regulation seeks to solve, and one is the cost-benefit analysis, which we'll treat later. A quick review of the statement of objectives. A main part of it is to ask the question, under which objective, under which law is this action being pursued? And as we talked earlier about process protecting regulators, particularly against accusations of acting ultra-vires, this is one of the key things that, if done early in the process, can save time, trouble, and make the regulatory action far more legitimate in the eyes of the regulated entities. Why is it so critical to state clearly the problem the regulation seeks to solve? Well, one is that it puts the proposed regulation in the correct technical context. And again, with economic and financial regulation, these questions are not simple. They often rest on complex understanding of the market, complex data patterns. They may involve very deep principles of regulation and law. It's important that these be brought out as early as possible in the process. Of course, the immense benefit of doing so is that you will get outstanding feedback from the market, potentially, in which other people who are not in government but care deeply about this issue because they're affected by it have an opportunity to step forward and provide their feedback. They may even be able to shape or point out areas of regulation, things that the regulator has not yet considered. It's all part of a process of generating a high-quality technical document that actually may stand to make the change that the regulator wants to do. A quick word on cost-benefit analysis, which will be covered by our colleague Suyash later on. What is it there to do? It provides a qualitative and quantitative information about the likely consequences of the regulation. It's important because it encourages consideration of all the positive and negative effects across all affected groups. There are some additional things which may happen and which we have seen happening in best practices in other jurisdictions, is that a standardized method of cost-benefit analysis allows people to get a better sense of how to assess regulations in general. It speeds up the process, it allows people to benchmark better. That's valuable both for the government, for the regulator, and for the regulated entities. Further, a good cost-benefit analysis can capture cross-sector effects and linkages. And it can also, now this is not necessarily the main criteria, but it may help in producing cost-effective regulatory action. At least it helps certainly regulators to pick from multiple options, some of which may seem very different on the surface. Now, just a word on the commentary process of draft regulations. I think it's the case that most, if not all, regulators do engage in stakeholder consultations. Often these are, and we have been part of those processes as well, so we understand that there are often industry groups. Industry groups have a very good idea of the space, as good as an idea sometimes, if not better, than the regulators. They have complex and deeply held views about the way that the regulations should look. Chances are that they are also quite well informed about the pace and style of regulations that are being formed, and they're in a good position to step forward at the right time and offer helpful advice and useful information that they have absorbed from the market. However, there is always the problem, which as economists we call economic capture, in the sense that those may be the only perspectives you hear, and those may unduly influence the way that the regulations are formed. So when we went out and looked at the different processes across the world, we found that there are many which try to combat this problem, which try to standardize the process for getting comments, and which actually try and seek the broadest net, cast the widest net possible. So I'd ask you to turn once again to your handbook. Page 57 is an example for the Financial Services Authority of the UK, and it shows, it's a screenshot from their public comments website. If you just take a moment to have a look at it, you'll see that it asks whether the person giving feedback, and it's in electronic form, whether the person is an individual, a representative of an authorized firm, or a representative of a professional firm. But it also, if you'll notice, the questions below are quite closely tailored to a particular piece of proposed legislation. And it's this level of care and specificity that can vastly improve the quality of the regulation if this kind of information is collected.
Once we had prepared the slide and we had run it by some people, the first comment was, where is the differentiating factor between processes and red tapeism? And that's something which opened eyes. Like, is it red tapeism? Is it like something unnecessary that we are putting on you to follow, which is in line with how, probably it's an unpolitical thing to say, but how our government works these days. Like, there are unnecessary processes which are just, not required. And after like a lot of deliberation, our answer to this question was very simple. A process is different from a red tape. If we take that process out, the whole structure collapses. Is there any process in this whole structure that can be taken out of context and the structure doesn't collapse? That is probably a red tape. But here, if you see, all three important parts of the decision making is being done at the highest governance level. All the preparatory work that's required to achieve that decision making is happening before that. So it's a very carefully crafted process which differs substantially from red tapeism. And that is our submission to it. So we want you to make an appeal to you that don't treat it as burdensome, as something which we are trying to impose on you, but it's simply a process that achieves a very fundamental objective that we had, which has been the running theme since our opening speech by Dr. Krishnan. Thank you.